Hey everybody, happy to be back with you with a little bit more content from the YouTube content mines. Just got back to Virginia from the California trip and am about to leave again to go up to help present at a multimodal AI conference up at MIT. I thought I would take this opportunity to follow up on there's been a lot going on obviously in the post-election space, and some of the stuff that is coming out of the Trump administration actually relates more intimately, I think, to Virginia than anywhere else. So I thought I'd tackle that while I was here. The newest move looks to be Trump following up on some of his desires to remove federal employees from the DMV area as part of the quote-unquote government efficiency efforts, looking to maybe relocate people elsewhere in the country. This is, for Trump, obviously a deeply political issue. I think there's always the kind of fiscal and monetary efficiency argument, but he continually and often frames it as looking to move jobs away from quote unquote the swamp to places where I think his exact phrasing is like real American patriots or something like that, right? To go find real quote unquote real Americans who can do these jobs and move them out of the DC orbit. And I think that's obviously has political overtones that are not particularly subtle, right? What he wants is more MAGA folks in these positions, not just Republicans, but true MAGA individuals in these civil service roles. In the past, obviously, he tried this with the Bureau of Land Management, as well as the USDA. I can't remember the components. There was two subcomponents of the USDA that he tried to move or moved. Those were both walked back pretty quickly under the Biden administration, and there's a lot of argument to be made that it never really worked that well in the first place. But so I'll talk a bit about that, a bit about why I think it's obviously a concern for Virginia's economy, but also why I'm not overly concerned about it, and maybe what's driving it a little bit more strategically for the Republicans at large. But so what Trump has suggested time and again is that there's probably at least 100,000 people that could be moved out of the DMV almost immediately with the relocation of certain agencies. This doesn't really hold up to scrutiny, though. When he tried to move the BLM out to Grand Junction, about 80% of the people that worked for BLM didn't move, right? So first and foremost, I think this is really an issue that it would appear is more difficult under the surface than Trump's initial claims would lead you to believe. So because of that sort of political coding, right, that the Trump administration sees these civil servants as disloyal and not MAGA, I think it's pretty clear to me that a huge motivation to do these kinds of job relocations has more to do with really wanting to enrich the labor market, perhaps in some more conservative states. And really, if you look at the Electoral College map, you can see that especially in this cycle, at least Virginia really stood out as kind of a bastion of some Democratic wins. I think the strategy there for Republicans, at large, is pretty clear. They would like to continue to impact the Northern Virginia region and kind of reconfigure that labor market as much as possible. I think that's a bit of a pipe dream, but I think that's pretty obviously their sort of grand plan here. I don't think it's as much a concern of, obviously the efficiency argument is one that's pretty hollow, that rings pretty hollow when you consider the actual the budgeting of the Trump administration. Typically the budgets that accompany a Republican administration, as we all know, as we can look at a chart, right, the Republican administrations tend to not be particularly fiscally conservative, and that's been true since the early 2000s. So I think that can kind of be ruled out offhand as an earnest motivation. I think that's obviously what the Trump administration has conveyed this decision as to the American public, is one concerned with fiscal responsibility. But obviously in practice that won't be the reality. Then we have to ask under the hood what's driving this, and I think that really is more likely to be related to some of these structural desires to reconfigure the labor market in areas that would be beneficial to the Republican Party. So how worried should Virginians be? Is this really a pressing looming financial catastrophe for Virginia's economy? How mad should we be at Glenn Youngkin, our governor, for not being more defensive to these kinds of policies when obviously a huge part of his constituency lives in Northern Virginia, whether he decides to represent them or not? First and foremost is I think a lot of this will be challenged in court and will take a substantial amount of time. Second of all, a lot of the relocation, the ability for agencies to relocate personnel tends to revolve around the senior kind of executive leadership that they can force to do that. Those folks, for example, with BLM, were forced to move, but I think in the case of BLM, the figures I've seen are somewhere in the 80% range of folks that just didn't ever make that transition. They didn't move to Grand Junction from DC. They just continued to live in DC. Similarly, with the USDA, in the movements there during the first Trump administration, something like 40 to 60% of the affected workers simply just moved on to other jobs, right? So it really is talking about people's lives here, embedded folks who are not just going to up and move to follow their job to Alaska or South Dakota or something like that. So these people live in Northern Virginia. They, for the most part, will continue to live there. These are still civil servants as well. There's a certain amount of time that's required to be given to them, kind of an intermediary period where they can look for other work. And a lot of these relocation activities are not able to be initiated until a certain period of time passes with new leadership. So that's all to say there's a lot of structural stuff in place that it's going to slow this down substantially. I think that's all well and good. Obviously, if the president, the full force of the executive branch, gets leveled onto this, certainly a lot of organizations could be moved or gutted or whatever might happen. A lot of these people do ultimately serve at the behest of the president. It's important to remember, however, that 80 to 90% of the federal workforce, well, a lot of people live and work in Northern Virginia and Maryland. 80 to 90% of these people don't live in that region, right? A lot of federal workers live elsewhere in the country. Indeed, the vast majority of them do. So what you'll see, I think, one of my predictions is, obviously, while we have a slight majority for the Republic, a very tiny majority in the House, you're going to start to see pretty quickly, I think, ramifications for local labor markets that are obviously heavily dependent on federal workers. That outcry will happen much more quickly than I think any kind of ability to specifically target, say, Northern Virginia or Southern Maryland's labor market to do some kind of political restructuring by somehow moving these people elsewhere or forcing them to economically relocate to other areas to find work. And that's all to say, I think there will be economic consequences that are far-reaching if anything like this is attempted. It's similar to me in some ways to the immigration debate, where whatever your policy preferences are there for an administration that's come in promising sort of economic revival and a reinvigoration of the middle class through a lot of economic growth. Certainly one way to fight against the perception of such growth would be to eliminate hundreds of thousands of middle-class jobs in critical swing states like Virginia. I think that would not go over particularly well with a lot of elected representatives in Congress, and would make it more difficult to make real vigorous claims to sort of economic revival or growth if you're talking about huge losses of jobs in critical markets. So that's all to say, I'm deeply concerned about the proposal. I think obviously there's a lot of civil servants and federal employees who are extremely stressed out by this, and I think that's totally warranted. That said, I think if the Trump administration is able to achieve any of these goals or start to initiate any of these goals, you'll see a lot of economic pain long before you'll see any kind of structural political, like a restructuring in Virginia or Maryland politics from these kinds of moves. I think there's a lot of path dependency. There's a lot of embeddedness of people in communities that would make it very difficult to leverage the hiring power of the federal government to reconstitute House districts or something like that to lean more Republican. And I think, frankly, if these if these policies are pursued vigorously by the Trump administration, you'll very quickly start to see a real split and a real unpopularity for Republicans in Virginia in particular, a fairly unpopular governor to begin with in a lot of ways. If it comes to pass that Glenn Youngkin isn't particularly defensive of these jobs that are really critical to Virginia's economy, that would be in a lot of ways political suicide for him. So as always, really interested in your comments and your thoughts down below. I got a lot of great comments actually from in particular from, I think, people more right-wing than I am, or further to the right than I am on the last video. But I did find a lot of the comments really interesting in that, what I was saying was really revolving around a lack of ability to message on the part of the Democrats, what might describe that, in my opinion, how the right-wing media plays into that phenomenon. And a lot of the comments from the right kind of, I think, unintentionally or inadvertently sort of prove my point that they continue to harp on things that, if you go back and look at the tape, the Harris administration wasn't really emphasizing all that much actually in their messaging. But yeah, so go back and watch that video, leave a comment there if you haven't already. Love to read your comments here, especially if you live in Virginia. And I'll check in a little bit later in the week with probably some AI thoughts. It'll be a big AI week for me personally, so looking forward to that. See you then.